Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent. This is our weekly 2 cents segment, and we're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. And in the 2 cent segment, we take a plain English look at the big three property news stories of the week. And I'm joined, as usual, by Chris Bates. G'day, Chris. How's things?
Mate, life's good. How are you doing over there in the UK, Pete? You must be coming home soon, are you?
I'm indeed, yeah. We've got the Rask Roadshow coming up. Just been playing a bit of golf this week, and the British Open's been on as well. It was a bit drizzly, to be honest, but yes, and not too long till I'm back on a plane to Australia. What's happening over there?
Mate, I'm doing the opposite. I'm actually exiting Australia on Tuesday for 12 nights or something in Fiji. So we're the Bates household is trying to avoid getting sick. So I'm not sure what little nuclear weapons my daughter will bring home from kindy tomorrow. But if we can get through Thursday and Monday, we were on the home straight. So
yeah, I've noticed airfares are down a little bit. They're probably certainly flying London. They seem to be down about 20-25% from where they were. They did go sky high for a period there. So just starting to ease, thankfully, because it's been pretty painful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people haven't been booking their holidays if their flights are really expensive. It's sort of like I guess the ticket, you think, if I can book a cheap flight, and then you forget that the actual major expense on the holidays is once you actually start traveling, the hotels, the food, the flight's usually the cheap bit by the end of it. So what's happening in the property world this week, Pete? There's always lots going on.
So we're recording this on Wednesday morning, right before the release of the all-important inflation figures. So we'll do a deep dive on those next week. I guess the debate will roughly revolve around whether inflation falling is good enough for now, or whether inflation needs to be back down to target ASAP, in which case more rate hikes. So as you listen to this, you'll have the information to hand. We're flying blind here because the figures are out in about 2 hours' time. So we'll come back to the inflation figures next week. The big three property news stories this week. So if you're not familiar, every Sunday at 7 a.m., you'll find a 2 cents segment in your favorite podcast player. This week, so the first news story, interesting report out from Jarden about listings data since 2010, and now it shows more people are selling in Sydney. So we've been through this long period of low supply, and now suddenly new listings are actually above average. Only just recently has this happened, but is this the start of a wider trend towards some forced sales or people exiting the market? Second news story, which is kind of related actually, mortgage stress and mortgage arrears are now rising across all the data sets. So Moody's, S&P, Fitch, Experian, they're all reporting the same thing. Personal debt arrears and also home loan arrears on the way up. So we're going to take a look at how serious that is and where the stress is emerging in the country, around which suburbs and so on. And then thirdly, Victoria, it sounds like rent controls are potentially on the table. So we've seen this once before in Victoria not so long ago, and now it seems that everything's on the table. We've got a land tax proposal and now rent control. So we're going to take a look at what's going on in Victoria and what all that might mean. So, Chris, let's kick off with the Jarden report, because I know you did some analysis on this on your LinkedIn. So what's it showing? I guess investors are probably leading the way in terms of selling.
Look, I do a bit of consulting with Jarden. I'm one of their sort of mortgage brokers they come to talk to when they want to know what's happening on the ground with banks and borrowers, etc. And so I always like to get a bit of insights with their reports as well from Carlos and the team there. I mean, it's a really interesting report they've done. Is they've basically the title of it is around mortgage prisoners, right? How rates have gone up so much, how many people can't refinance, and Their numbers are showing maybe even 20% of people can't refinance. And that's a big deal if you can't refinance, because you can't restructure your repayments, you can't get a better interest rate, you can't release buffers. But they did make a really good point that there's been a change with borrowing assessment rates for people to refinance. So you can refinance on a 1% assessment rate rather than a 3%, which means that you've got an extra 20% borrowing capacity. So that really reduces the number that can't refinance. And I mean, their report also highlighted that just how little listings came onto the market, because they, CoreLogic do a lot of the 5-year average on listings. And, I've always wanted to know, well, what's the 10-year? What's the over the last, 10, 15 years? And this is a good report, saved me doing the digging myself, because it really showed the listing numbers and how it flew. It went through the year, and it just showed that 2021 was enormous listings into the tail end of 2021. And that makes sense because people list when markets are good, when times are good. They take money off the table, or they're confident because there's this FOMO. We need to upgrade now, otherwise we're going to miss it. And so listings always follow growth. And I think and the opposite happens when growth's not looking great, listings fall off a cliff. And the exactly thing happened. It was mirror image across different states. 2021, even into 2022, very high listing, decade high numbers. And then as soon as that rate started going up, listings fell off a cliff and at all-time lows. Well, over that period, there was lowest since 2010. The start of 2023, the lowest since 2010. But what was interesting with this report is it did show that listing numbers have really sort of jumped in the last month, unseasonal. Look, I think this is a really big thing to watch over the next 6 months is, do listings keep on increasing? Because listings also, that's really I believe, the key ingredient that it completely flips the sentiment in the market. If people feel like they've got choice, they feel like there's no need to be urgent, they sit on their hands, more listings come on, and then it's just really the seller has to come to the buyer, not the other way around. And so I think Carlos and the team didn't really go and identify where those listings are. We spoke a bit on the last 2 cents on where they're coming up. But it's going to be interesting to see, listings numbers could come up, but that doesn't mean the whole market's coming up. I believe it's going to be in a lot of these investor hotspots, which the initial data also agrees with.
So parsing these figures and just looking at the graph, yes, at the beginning of 2023, new listings in Sydney were pretty much at decade lows. And then just in the last month, they're now rising. Now, the interesting thing to me on this graph, which you can't see on a podcast, is that normally at this time of year, listings would actually be pretty flat if you look at the average over the past 12 years. But for this time of year, well, they're actually going up now. So it's like the spring selling season has come early, and it could be that potentially by towards the end of the year, we could be actually well above average on the current trajectory anyway. Do you get a sense, Chris, from the reporting of some of the areas where the listings are coming on? I know we talked about previously with some of the suburb trends figures that some of the areas where the listings are really taking off are places like Logan and some of the regional Queensland markets. So I guess where people have largely been focused on investing for cash flow, where mortgage rates were low, and now mortgage rates have gone up and some people are exiting the market.
Yeah, I mean, that's typically, there's a whole cohort of property people who believe that positive cash flow, and a lot of investors get sold this dream. You can get amazing cash flow and amazing growth. It's just the holy grail. If that was so easy, then, everyone would be property millionaires and they'd keep buying more and more and more. It's just the reality is not many people buy more than one investment property because they don't get the holy grail. We don't even really think it exists. And so a lot of people, property investors, they say, I want to buy an investment, but don't want it to cost me any money. I just don't want to put any money in my pocket. I want to, live my great life and not and build wealth without making any sacrifices. And what ends up happening is they end up going to areas where they're paying a higher rent as a percentage of the property. But there's usually a risk attached to that. And that's either a lot of other investors, a lot of supply risk, a lot of maybe the demand from owner occupiers, not that strong in terms of the demographic that are buying there. And I think in the last 3 years, there's been quite a bit of growth across the whole market because a rising tide lifts all shifts, right? So when interest rates went from 4% down to 2%, and borrowing capacities went through the roof and FOMO kicked in 2021, All properties went up because there was not enough properties selling and too many buyers, right? And I think a lot of that's getting unwound. I think the interest rates have done the complete opposite. They're higher than when they went into 2020, and a lot of investors are running for the hills because that positive cash flow is no longer positive cash flow when rates are 6 or 7%. Unfortunately, as well, a lot of these investors have gone to brokers who have had to stretch their borrowing capacities. Maybe it's their second or third one, and they've had to go into non-bank lenders, which typically offer you more borrowing capacity than the bigger banks. And unfortunately, we think that they're also being mortgage prisoners in these banks because they can't refinance those loans. And what's ended up happening is the non-banks haven't reduced their interest rates like the big banks have. So they could be on 7+% interest rates, can't refinance. The rents, even though they've gone up, aren't enough to cover the higher interest. And that's now negative cash flow. And they've got a choice. Do we keep funding a negative cash flow property when money's tight? Because our owner-occupier home's gone through the roof, our interest rate. Or do we sell our investment property or sell our home? And what are people going to make in that scenario? They're going to sell their investment property and try to knuckle down and keep their home.
I think some of the other areas where you might start to see a bit of a build up in listings is probably in some of those higher density type of markets, because that's where investors are heavily concentrated. So you might see a jump in listings in some of those pockets. It doesn't necessarily mean some of the lower density areas like the eastern suburbs of Sydney or lower North Shore and northern beaches, maybe not so much. Certainly it's not showing in the listings figures now. We are seeing increases in some markets, but certainly not some of those blue chip areas. It's just not been happening. Chris, I guess this kind of almost directly rolls into our second story, which is about the rise of mortgage stress and mortgage arrears, because it's kind of showing similar thing, really. Some of those blue chip areas, mortgage arrears are the lowest in the country. So I guess the story, and it's picked up in a few different places. We've got the Australian James Kirby did a piece on it, but I guess the story is sort of doing the rounds a little bit, and that is that personal loan arrears are now rising, which tends to foreshadow a rise in home loan arrears. And actually, home loan arrears now been rising steadily since around about October last year, which would make sense because interest rates have been on the way up. I think usually the biggest indicator of mortgage stress and mortgage arrears is simply whether people have a job or not. And the unemployment rate in New South Wales fell to 2.9% last month. So that's the lowest on record since the ABS data series started 40 odd years ago. So that most people still have a job, and especially in New South Wales, but we're starting to see some mortgages falling into arrears. So it looks to me, Chris, like from the figures anyway, that the outer suburban mortgage belt seems to be the place where the arrears are highest. So Sydney Southwest, outer Southwest, outer West, and also Melbourne Northwest. But the lowest areas, again, eastern suburbs, North Shore, northern beaches, Brisbane North, and those kind of blue chip areas. So, yeah, do you get any sense from some of your clients about mortgage stress, mortgage arrears, and what kind of sort of feedback are you getting? What kind of actions are people taking?
Look, I mean, we've got a marketplace that is in those more premium areas. I mean, our average loan size per client coming into 2022 was about 1.5 million, right? And so all our clients typically are buying in those other areas, and we have got very little clients buying in the areas where those arrears are. However, we are absolutely seeing, particularly clients who took on loans in 2021 and or 20, even start of 2022 or late 2020. Whose repayments have jumped up massively. They're coming off fixed rates, and weekly we're talking them through the new repayments. How do we get them on a better variable rate? Is there ways to refinance, etc.? I do believe no matter, even if someone's doing really well financially and they are on top of their mortgage, they're very rate conscious right now, and they're very conscious of how their repayments are jumping up. And so they're naturally a little bit more conservative by nature, hence why they're on top of their debt. But that's also making them make cutbacks, even if they know they're on top of it and they could be out there spending money and they're really on top of their mortgage. I feel like they're making cutbacks too. So I don't think it's just the people who are in big mortgages and are getting debt stress. I think everyone's naturally moving towards being a bit more conservative with their money and are really wanting to, are really worried about the interest rates, really. And I think there's a bit of job stress. I know unemployments are all time low, but I think people are worried about potentially a recession coming, and they're really starting to make cutbacks. That would be my observation. I think we've got more inquiry than ever. Clients really wanting to know how they're going to get through this period. We've got one client in a payment holiday. And so if you do get to this situation, I did a post on LinkedIn about all these other options before you speak to the bank in terms of, lots of different things. But if you do get to this last situation when you're speaking to a bank, banks will most likely will give you a 6-month payment holiday. They'll most likely give you options for interest only. They'll work with you, especially if it's not, the property doesn't look like it's in negative equity, and there's a reason why things are tough right now. Maybe in this situation for our client, he was made redundant, and so they said, look, we'll give you 6 months to get another job and get on top of your mortgage, and no repayments for 6 months. And so, yeah, we aren't seeing it, but we are seeing people worried about it. So we're not seeing people going into arrears, but I do imagine in the outer rings, it's becoming more and more of a problem.
I think the big question, Chris, is could we see like an Armageddon scenario? If you look back at the RBA rate hike cycle, so 1994, 99, 2002, 2009, and this most recent one, which commenced May 2022. So we're only just over a year into this cycle. But there's never been a cycle like this where we've gone from, I guess a cash rate target of near enough zero. So we've seen 400 basis points of hikes in a very quick space of time, very short period. So none of those previous cycles saw anything like this. So 1994, yes, there was a rapid increase, but that was only 275 basis points. This time we've had 400. And yes, we were coming from zero, but that's really going to shake some household budgets, because much as people keep buffers and so on, nobody was really expecting, I think, the dramatic turnaround in fortunes for the budget, the economy, for unemployment. I mean, it's not so long ago, unemployment forecasts were sort of 10, 12%, and now we're at the lowest in New South Wales, lowest in modern history. So I guess that's the question, Chris. Do you think there could be a scenario here where we just get mass defaults and a rush for the exits, and people defaulting left, right, and centre? And I guess that's, people have been talking about this for as long as I can remember. But do you think this could be the one?
I think we went into this with a massive undersupply, still growth in our house and land packages. We haven't really been releasing heaps. We're not building a lot. And so I think there's this overbuilding, oversupply of these type of properties. So even if we do see an increase in listing numbers, personally, I think there's enough pent-up demand from people wanting to get into the market. And if there is any type of pullback in prices, I think that'll be offset by first-home buyers. There may be a borrowing capacity issue for these first-home buyers. I think that's the issue potentially. So let's say someone bought a house and land package for $1 million in Western Sydney. And, to do that, you needed a salary of, say, 150, right, to 170. Well, now you probably need a salary closer to 250, right, because borrowing capacity has fallen. So that could be a bit of an issue, right? So there could be a repricing event. But I think there's enough buyers there that would, because there's very little options on the new building, because, I think that's really drying up. And people want to own established, not the new build, because they're worried about building issues. And so I don't think there's an Armageddon situation, but I do think there could be a bit of a repricing there. Back down to borrowing capacity. I think the unit market is typically with a lot of investors. I do think a lot of first-home buyers don't want to go near high density. They've read about the building issues. They're constantly in the news. There was ones recently with defects, and they're all sort of switching on that the more established, older Art Deco blocks are better investments. I think a massive change from 5 to 8 years ago when I would start talking about this with clients. People just were completely unaware. And so I think there could be a bit of an issue there where you start to see a lot of investors bailing in these investor hotspots. And in high density apartments, which you alluded to, Pete. But is there 30, 40% price falls or something like that? I highly doubt it. But, there could be this at least pressure downwards, because a lot of those apartments didn't go up in COVID either. This is, everyone thought that everything boomed in 2021. But if you go look at apartment prices in Parramatta, Epping, lots of different places, Woolli Creek, did apartments go up in that when interest rates went to 2%? No. So are they going to potentially go down when interest rates go up to 6%? You'd have to wonder.
Yeah, so I think when you look at some of the housing market scenarios where people talk about, a major crash, big arrears and a real sort of cascading downward spiral. It's usually, you talk about scenarios where, yes, you're right, big overbuild or oversupply of properties, very high mortgage rates causing mass defaults, or a big rise in unemployment. So we don't have any issues on the overbuild side of the equation. In fact, we've got a real undersupply in a lot of key areas, with especially with the rapid rate of population growth. So I don't think the demand side is going to be too much of an issue. In terms of high mortgage rates, well, yes, relatively they are higher than they were, but they're not very high. I think the unemployment question is interesting. Job vacancies were so high. We had about 450,000 job vacancies at the peak, and they've come down a fair bit, maybe 20% or so from the highs, but there's still a lot of job vacancies and a lot of people filling those vacancies. So I guess it suggests that the unemployment rate at the moment anyway is going to stay pretty low. It's still around 3.5%. Definitely a watch this space though, because so the interest rates went up in May. They went up again in June. We've still got fixed rate mortgages resetting. And I think the data providers, I mean, they all show different things, but I guess the key message is, well, yes, I think some of those borrowers who took out fixed rate mortgages at very low interest rates during the pandemic, usually with short periods, 1 or 2 years, fixed rates. Well, when those home loans expire over the next 6-12 months, and some of those are going to roll over into obviously much higher mortgage rates, well, that's really where there's going to be some risk of fallout, especially if the unemployment rate is rising. I think generally, though, I mean, despite the increase in home loan arrears, still only around sort of 1.4% or so 30-day arrears. Interesting that owner-occupier arrears at 1.5% are quite a lot higher than investor arrears at only 1%. So not necessarily what you'd expect given all the media coverage, but I suppose that largely reflects that we've got very low rental vacancy rates, and most investors are finding it pretty easy to tenant.
Yeah, and I think we just went into this with very low total listings across the country, right? We didn't go into this situation where there was lots of people selling, and there's just accruing of listings on the markets. Total listings across the market still ridiculously low, and so I would say that I'd say the payment holidays, how banks are going to protect people, and I also think people are, if they start to feel like the other side, there's light at the other tunnel. So let's say inflation data comes out more positive, and maybe we get this peak in rates, and maybe they're like, well, I've only got to get through a couple of years till we potentially get some rate cuts, and there's and then family will help, and I do think there'll be this this natural thing is, fixed rates are coming off, there's going to be these arrears, there's going to be this rush of properties on the market. It's just this, that makes a great headline story. In reality, does it play out like that? And is it that simple? Absolutely not. So,
well, we've seen the interest-only cliff was another good example, wasn't it? With it had all those interest-only mortgages resetting, and there were big changes to macro-prudential rules. And yes, it doesn't really work in that way. It's not like everyone comes off on one particular day and the world ends. It's actually it's really a process rather than an event. And I expect the fixed rate cliff will be similar. There'll be some pain, there'll be some defaults and some forced sales, but it's not necessarily an all or nothing scenario. And as you said, people usually muddle through these things. And I think banks are generally, I mean, they're well aware of what's coming, and they're certainly quite keen to work with borrowers who are facing some stress, maybe with mortgage holidays or interest-only periods. So, it'll be an interesting year ahead on that front. Chris, let's wrap up with our third story. What's happening in Victoria. So recent media reporting, the Premier is now proposing not only a broader scope and higher rate of land tax for property investors, which you already knew about, but now discussing or proposing potentially rent caps, which could be on the table, or rent controls. And also there's been some talk about future taxes or restrictions on Airbnbs potentially. So it sounds like everything's on the table. What's going on down in Victoria, Chris?
Yeah, it's a real attack on investors. And I think there's been an attack on investors all the way back to 2015, 2014. It was, investors were causing a lot of that boom back then. And there was very relaxed lending to investors. They could get, 10 times income. They could get interest only. There was issues with borrowing calculators across all the different banks. And I think that back then there was this, with investors are basically pushing out first home buyers, and it's just since then it's been a massive attack on investors in terms of their borrowing capacity. They're always the fallout when the government can blame for housing unaffordability. That's what Labor pitched at the 2019 election with negative gearing. And so I just think there's this, and that's what we've got, a rental crisis right now, because rental crisis, you need more investors entering the market. There's always investors leaving, but you need to keep investors coming to the market to create rental stock and rental listings for people to rent. So if you don't have investors, then you're going to have rental crises and a shortfall. And so that's, I think, the big issue here is that Dan Andrews is, Victoria's always been an area that if investors are truly borderless, right? If they haven't been in the past, there's always been a home bias, buy an investment property. It might even be by your neighbor. That's how bad home bias was. People would buy within their local area, things they could see and touch and drive past. But I do think like the new generation of investors coming through a little bit like, well, that's going to be expensive. What other places around the country could I do? Could I use a buyer's agent? And so you've got to be really careful pissing off investors, to be honest, because if they say, oh, you know what, I'm not going to invest in Victoria, they'll start investing in other places around the country. And I think that's the tight line that Dan Andrews is sort of running here. He's already attacking people with holiday homes. He's attacking Airbnbs at the moment. He's attacking, land tax, second homes. And so, are investors really the issue here, or is it, something, a bigger picture problem?
I've seen this in the United Kingdom where they actually under Conservative government as well. So it's not just a left-right thing, where the mortgage interest deductibility, particularly for higher rate taxpayers, it wasn't fully deductible. And we've just seen a mass exodus from the private landlord market, which, okay, in the short term, it brings some supply onto the market, but over time, it really hasn't helped the rental market. There's rental crisis emerging in many parts of the country. So I think I can understand why the land tax was broadened and the rate was increased, largely because to balance the budget, because the debt blew out so significantly with all the lockdowns. And, there's obviously a housing shortage, but there's so little public housing or social housing being built, certainly on a net basis. And we've got record high population growth. So I guess in terms of the potential impacts, Chris, rent controls, in the short terms, yes, it could actually keep a lid on rental price growth. But I suppose standard economic theory says rent controls don't work, because if you try and push rents down while landlords decide to sell up or not rent out their properties, and that ultimately reduces the amount of rentals available. And I think there's enough sort of evidence globally. There's cities like San Francisco, Germany tried rent controls, which seemed to work in Berlin, but not in other parts of the country, which probably goes back to your point. The world is sort of more global now, and capital can flow much more freely interstate, but even internationally.
Yeah.
So look, an investor might say, well, why would I invest in a state where I'm less welcome as a landlord when I could just go to New South Wales or Western Australia or potentially somewhere else in the country? So I think in the medium term, that could happen. And I guess rent controls normally are thought to reduce the supply of housing by up to 15%. Basically having the opposite effect from what's intended.
Yeah, and I think what do you do as an investor? If mortgage rates were really low, then people are more likely to say, well, the rent doesn't matter as much because my costs aren't as much. But in this situation, a lot of investors are hurting, and the market economy may say, actually, well, there's an undersupply. I could up my rents, and I need to. That it's either up my rents or I sell the property. And if people can't up their rents, then they're more likely to sell, and that would be great for first home buyers. And there's always a pro and a con, right? More listings will probably create more options for first home buyers, but unfortunately, a lot of our investors have been buying, in particular in Melbourne, has been off the plan and high density apartments. They've fallen for the depreciation trap. And you buy a new property, you get all these tax benefits, and a lot of them. Investors have switched on to realize they've had zero capital growth or very little capital growth. They may have got a bit of a tax deduction, but so if they start to sell to the market, well, a lot of first home buyers don't really want those. They know they're not great investments. And so it's not really helping first home buyers buying the stuff that investors don't really want. And so I think it's just the Airbnb is an interesting one. I do think it's an easy target. There's a lot of, but you've got to be careful targeting Airbnb. That's tourism, right? If people can come here and rent apartments on Airbnb and they can get hotels. Also, it allows people with the economy. Like when we go to Melbourne, we get an Airbnb in the city, right? And because we've got a family and we don't really want to live in a hotel, so it gives us a different option. So I think there's going to be a target on Airbnb, whether it's a day rate like a little premium, $5 or $10 a night. If you think about all the nights that are rented in Melbourne or Victoria every night, there'd be a lot of money the government could collect there. And I think it's just going to be a little gravy train that they're going to want to be a part of.
It's a difficult one to know how to go about tackling. Clearly, Airbnb is a big issue. I've seen in parts of Sydney whole tower blocks of Airbnbs, and actually, you're right, Melbourne, South Bank, the same. Maybe rather than restrictions, it might be taxes that come in. I think just generally on the rent controls point, I mean, do caps ever work in economics? I mean, if it was that simple, why wouldn't we just cap inflation at 3%? We'd cap interest rates at 3.5%, and and so on. There's a reason why we don't just do that sort of thing and you let markets work things out. I mean, certainly rent controls didn't work particularly well in the US, in New York. Landlords stopped spending on repairs. I think if you actually go back even through Australia's history, they had not only rent controls during the war and so on, but also even price controls. But I think the problem is people just start finding ways around it, and they certainly did in Australia. People would start making sort of outsized payments for furniture and things like that, and eventually the controls were scrapped. I think if we went down this route in Australia today, we'd probably get some unintended consequences, maybe an extra increase in the number of persons per dwelling, maybe more crowding, less spending on repairs. And anyway, when the rent control period ends, you probably just see a bigger increase. But maybe as a short term, it could actually fix, at least keep a lid on rents. And that's, that was certainly the experience in Berlin. It worked in the short term. So again, it's another watch this space, and nothing's actually legislated at this point. But yeah, I mean, who knows? We could see 2 million Aussies have their rent frozen for a couple of years, which certainly on the inflation point would be welcome, certainly in the short term.
Yeah, and so when we're looking at clients with the option of, okay, well, I've got a budget, and I can go, that budget, say it's quite a significant one, so it's not 200-300 grand. So they've got options. They can go to Brisbane, they can go, Sydney apartment, they could go a house in Central Coast or Wollongong, or they could go a house in Melbourne, or they've got options, right? When they look at those doors, this literally happened for a client yesterday. We looked at Victoria, and the yields in Melbourne, like the rent you get versus the percentage of the property, have historically been the lowest, right? Versus somewhere like Queensland. So then if you're also saying we potentially need to pay more land tax, plus we have issues with rent controls, do we just avoid Victoria and do we go somewhere else? And I think that's the issue here, is that people are already having to go to Victoria because yields are very low, or you have to factor that in. And then potentially with rent controls, do you really want to take that bet? And so I think there is going to be this, and then I think also existing investors are more likely to leave the market as well. So let's watch this space. I think Queensland tried something a few months ago as well, Pete. Can't remember exactly the details because it didn't actually go ahead. What did they try? And it failed, right? Because it got a lot of bad publicity.
Oh, well, there's been the rent freeze, but also there was a proposal for taxes to be, so for if you had an investment property in Queensland, but you could actually be taxed on your portfolio in other states, which seemed almost unconstitutional at the time. Now, at first it went under the radar. Then there was an almighty shit fight as people realised. I had one example of somebody I know who actually had just a cheap rental unit up in, I think, Townsville or Bundaberg. And then she was like, well, hang on, I'm going to be taxed on my entire portfolio in Melbourne here just because of this little unit I've got. Of course, that was going to damage the rental supply, which is already chronic, especially in southeast Queensland. And eventually, I think once people thought it through, well, it got scrapped pretty quickly. But yeah, there's been some wild ideas being tossed around, and it seems it's not the stable sort of environment that people can make 10-year investment decisions when state governments are throwing ideas around, to a penny. So, it'd be good to get some consistency of policy, and then people can make the investment decisions with confidence. So wrap up on those three stories this week then. So, firstly, we talked about, the first thing we looked at was the Jarden report with listings now rising. So normally you wouldn't see that until spring, but now we're just starting, especially in Sydney, to see new listings. Actually, they're above average now for this time of year, which we haven't been able to say, for some years now. Secondly, mortgage stress and mortgage arrears and personal loan arrears are starting to rise, as you'd expect, I guess, with rising mortgage rates, but particularly in the mortgage belt suburbs, outer Sydney, northwest Melbourne, those kind of areas. And we're starting to see home loan delinquency rates rising, and then finally, proposed rent controls on top of the proposed land tax for property investors in Victoria. Certainly going to annoy a few people over the year or two ahead. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. I think some interesting stories for us to tackle next week. We'll have the inflation figures. Also, the ACT is undertaking a proposed radical rezoning plan. This is something that economists have been talking about for a long time, whether we could rezone or upzone certain parts of our cities to allow more density. And ACT could well be the test case, Chris. So we'll have to see how that one plays out over the next week or two.
Yeah, I mean, I saw in the SMH today as well, Sydney Metro West is, back on the table. And is it going to go ahead? That's a big story. That's a, massive infrastructure project, probably the biggest in the country. That doesn't go ahead. Also see there's a bit more in the YIMBY movement in Sydney. So there's lots always happening in the property stories. And I'm going to sneak in one more on Monday morning, Pete, before I go to Fiji. So I wish everyone a happy Sunday.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So you can catch me at Pete Wargent Blogspot. That's my daily blog, or at Pete Wargent on Twitter. Of course, you should subscribe for the Rask podcast on your favorite podcast player. And of course, on YouTube. And don't forget to grab your tickets for the Rask Roadshow. And Chris, if people want to give you a shout over at Blusk, where should they go for more?
Yeah, absolutely. Just in the show notes, as every episode, check us out. The team would love to sort of guide you through and get that clarity. It's a stressful time, no matter if you're thinking about buying or you've got a mortgage.
And by the way, as always, do send us your property questions via the link in the show notes, or even just to say hello and give us some feedback, because we're here to serve and chat about whatever's hot and whatever's not. So thanks for joining, Chris, and we'll see you next episode.
Thank you, Pete. Happy Sunday.
Cheers.